This is also an argument for AI as well. If you're using any sort of assisted mastering, something along those lines, is to deconstruct it. Why have they done that? And then try and emulate it. Like you mentioned there about if you've got a favorite producer, mix engineer, mastering engineer, and they've said they've done this to get this result, then you could follow similar steps with your own mix or production because you want that particular sound. But you're not copying verbatim their settings. You're just following the process, which I think is a great way of doing it.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Hey folks, welcome to Inside the Mix. Again, today, or rather in this episode, I'm joined by Tim Benson, aka Aisle9, and we are answering your questions again, or a question rather. And this particular question was submitted by a listener, and I've paraphrased it down to what are the common mistakes to avoid in music production. If you do have a question that you would like us to hash out on the podcast, click the SpeakPipe link in the episode description and leave us a message. Hey, Marc and Tim, my question is XYZ. You can find me at, and it's also an opportunity for you to give yourself a shout out. You don't need a SpeakPipe account. All you need is your mobile phone. Really easy to do. It's just leaving an audio message, and one lucky person each month will win a coffee voucher. So, welcome back, Tim. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah. We're been busy releasing stuff and busy doing all my normal sort of mixing and mastering. Yeah, but all good.
Indeed, busy times. So if you've ever felt stuck, overwhelmed, or unsure why your tracks aren't quite hitting the way you want, then this episode could well be for you, folks. We're going to be talking about some common traps that music producers from beginners to experienced might fall into, stuff that we've experienced as well. And I think I'll start off with mine, and I think this goes back to when I started music production in particular, and it's something that I've probably bleated on about on the podcast numerous times, and that is the use of reference tracks. And I say this to artists that I work with, particularly in coaching as well, a lot, is to use reference tracks, not only in mixing, I find, and essentially in mastering as well, but also in the actual production side of things as well. And I do this a lot. And I wish I started doing this when I first started creating music. Rather than sort of create it in a vacuum, I now have a Spotify playlist, which has a list of playlists, funnily enough, of songs that I've heard, and I think, I quite like the sound of that. I'd like to do something in that particular style. And then when I move on to that and a new project, I then use that as a reference, whether that's in terms of the actual structure of the track, maybe the arrangement, the sound design, whatever it may be. And that has helped me no end in terms of production. But it's something I wish that somebody had stressed to me the importance of way back in the beginning, and that is using references and reference tracks and not trying to do things in a vacuum. And I think that's particularly important from a home studio perspective, where your monitoring environment might not be the best, might not be perfect. So you can have that reference track that you know is of a high quality, and you know sort of what the sound is that you're aiming for. You can replicate that using your particular setup. But that's my one, would be references. Something that I wish somebody had, again, stressed to me when I was starting out.
So I think that's a really good one, actually. It's one, bizarrely enough, that I think I think there was a time where I used reference tracks a lot. I sort of got out the habit of it, probably because I'm sort of used to doing this and do it so much. But I've been using it a bit again recently, and so it's. I think the skill is also trying to find a reference track that's a really good match for your style or track. Sometimes that can be quite tricky, actually. But if you can find a good reference track, or maybe even sometimes you can even use your own track. Say you do a track and it comes out really well, and you find that it goes down well with other people. It comes out well, sounding balanced in nice, all the different places you listen to it, and you think like, yeah, I got that right that time. But there's no harm in using that as a bit of a reference sometimes, because you can reference how loud the bass is or how bright it is or whatever to that track. If you can't find another track that's more sort of better sort of representative of what you're doing, so that could be useful.
Yeah, I think using your own references, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's something that I do, and I think it's particularly important when you are releasing, or at least using it. I have like references and then compare tracks, and then I often use, well, in mastering, the compare track is me comparing it to the original mix, but with the reference in particular, if I'm releasing another song and it's part of a collection of songs, I might have more than one reference in terms of, and do what you said there, is where I'm using my original song as a reference as well. So you've got some continuity in sound. It's not just two songs that, although well produced, well mixed, well mastered, they may not sound like they've come from the same collection. And if you're doing an album in particular, you want some consistency in sound across those songs. I think also to add to that as well is, if you are using references, to make sure they're high fidelity as well.
Yeah.
Don't just
definitely
grab.
Don't use a dodgy MP3.
Some dodgy MP3 that's hissing at you throughout the entire session, like a snake, an asp hissing at you throughout the whole thing. But yes, references.
Yeah. If I was to chip in another one, then, so if we do a different one, common mistakes, I would say a common mistake is to sort of not pay enough attention to the recording. Say, particularly if you're doing a performance, you're recording your vocal or your guitar or something like that. I mean, even if you're playing the keyboard, but I know that a lot of the time now, if we're playing in MIDI or something, we can correct it inside the DAW. But either way, whatever you're doing, get the performance of it right. Don't just go, oh, that'll do, I'll fix it later. There's a sort of horrible bit where it clips here and sounds nasty, but that'll be fine. No one will hear it. I'll put lots of reverb on it or something. Those are not. In fact, that might be a real mistake. I'll put lots of reverb on it.
Yeah.
But don't feel you will fix things in that kind of way. Obviously, sometimes you end up with a project where you have got something and it is a mistake and it's not easy to fix and you've got to find a way around it. But ideally, you just want to make sure that isn't happening. If you've got control and you're recording it, make sure it's recorded well and take the time to go back over it, if it isn't well done. So, the common mistake is just thinking that you'll fix it later and it's okay, even if it, particularly things like clipping, where you just record something at the wrong level and it actually goes into the red and distorts. That is just never really what you want. And, that is sort of a common mistake, to think that clipping or distorting, and you've got to really check on both the input, and, the input into your sound audio interface, and sometimes, not normally, but it depends what you're doing with your DAW, but make sure it's not clipping internally in the DAW as well. But just make sure that you've recorded a nice clean version of whatever it is, so that you can mix it properly later. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, get it right at source, isn't
it? Get it right at source.
Get it right at source. Yeah, most
clear.
definitely. And I think that is pivotal. What you mentioned there made me laugh about the reverb, and I've often found that, in particular with vocals, it can be a common thing to think, oh, the vocal's not quite hitting, it's not quite there, I'll drown it in reverb. But you probably don't want to go down that route. I would say get it right at source.
I've made these things. I've done it myself and sort of recorded a vocal and somehow not really realised that my headphone was a bit off and I've got the click really blaring in my ear or something. And then afterwards I've gone, listened back, and I spent ages doing all the vocals, but not really paid attention to it, and then gone, oh no, I've got click all over the vocals, and then I've got like a bit of bass, and how did that happen? Well, my headphones weren't on properly, or I had the level up too loud or something. Or even worse, I had the speakers on while I was doing it and I didn't realise, these kind of common mistakes, like you can leave the speakers on while you're recording and wonder why you've got spill everywhere, So just make sure that, you get it right like that. But if you haven't got it right, you might have to just face redoing it.
Yeah, what you mentioned there about the speakers is, I think it's one mistake you will make once and you won't do it again. And I did that when I started the podcast. I did a podcast interview, and I left the speakers on while I was doing the interview. And then I don't think I was using Riverside when I was doing this, and I was listening to it back, and I was like, what is going on here? Why have I got this weird sort of chorusy effect going on? And then I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I've left the speakers on while I was doing it. So, yeah, it's a mistake you'll make once, I find, but you probably won't do it again.
It's like if you're hearing this podcast now and you can faintly hear birds in the distance, that will be because R9 was stupid enough to make the mistake of leaving the window open here. So I haven't shut that yet, but like the window is slightly open to my left, and you might hear the beautiful birds of Somerset in the back.
It's very nice. It's like a nice. If you're listening to this on headphones, you could also. If I did a binaural mix, it might be quite nice.
Yeah.
I just make it very immersive, like you're in the room with Tim as he's talking. Oh dear.
Yeah. So there we are.
What you mentioned there, about the speakers being on, reminds me. This is another key one actually, and I didn't think of this until you mentioned it. And this is in the realm of recording now. And I did this. I recorded a big band. I was using a 414, and I was recording a flute, if I remember rightly, or flautist. I believe that's what they are.
Flautist, yeah. Flautist.
A flautist might be someone who's flouting something.
Selling her wares, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a big band with someone just selling something casually at the front of the band. And I was recording this band, and I didn't check which way the microphone was facing, because they're very similar, both sides. I think one side has the
414,
Yeah, one side has the... Does it have the pickup pattern? I cannot remember if you can select the pickup pattern, but it certainly has the roll-off. And I recorded the room rather than the actual instrument. And that was an interesting mix. Because, again, I had the console in front of me, and I was pushing up the faders. Just bring in the flute. And I was like, I'm just hearing room. Well, I can hear the flute, but I'm also hearing a lot of room. And I was bringing it in, and then I realised that I had the microphone around the wrong way. So... I mean, this is a really quick one, but I think it touches on the idea of the speakers is if you are positioning microphones, it's a bit going outside the topic of sort of bedroom production, but make sure your microphone's facing the right way.
Yeah.
Double check. Just go in there, double check again before you start recording.
But it's even like this on a mic like this, where one side is picking up, but the other side looks almost identical, and apart from the fact that my other side's got a dent in it, but exactly. So you have to be careful, and I think we've all done it.
Yeah. That was. It was so long ago. I cannot remember how I overcame it. I think I might not have overcame it, to be fair. But I think if I remember rightly, while we're on the topic of immersive audio, I think I created an immersive mix with using. I can't remember what it was now, but it's slightly way off topic now. But it was. Yeah. I remember having, you can get those heads, the binaural head.
Yeah, the binaural heads.
Yeah, I had one of those in the middle of the room with the in ears, and I think I created a binaural mix, if I remember rightly. It was good fun.
Exciting.
But then I realised I'm not entirely sure there probably is a pathway in terms of career going down that route, but I don't know if I was fully invested in it to pursue it as a
Maybe I could have got work as the head. I'd just stand there.
You know what? They are super expensive. Those heads are massively expensive, man. They are super expensive. I can kind of see why, because with head-related transfer functions and all that. But
hey, if you're a bedroom producer listening to this will be useless to you.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
Well, you never know. You might buy a binaural head and start recording things. Yeah.
Yeah, genuinely, it is really interesting. However, I think for me now, if I were to start doing it again, it'd be more of like a vanity project, and just creating binaural. I had a tutor, great guy, when I was doing my master's degree, and he would just go to like the underground, and just record the sound using and have these in ears, these binaural in ears. Really interesting, but I'm not entirely sure what you do with it. But anyway, moving on to the next one. And
Moving
this
on,
is,
yeah.
yeah. The next one I have is labeling, and this is particularly important because this comes to labeling tracks, and I've experienced
Audio 1,
this.
Audio 2, Audio 3.
Yeah, exactly that. And I've had artists join me in the studio, and they bring their projects in, and they, because I've got the facility here where they can just plumb themselves into my setup, and they'll open up their device, whatever it may be, and then I'm like, okay, well, walk me through what you have here, and it's just Audio 1, Audio 2, Audio 3. It's all one solid block of color, and there are tracks just dotted. There's audio regions just dotted around. I'm like, well, what's that doing there? And we end up spending a session just deciphering what they have, whether they need it, and then labeling. So this, if anything, is a cost-saving measure for you listening, for the audience listening, to label. It will save you time. If you are intending to work with a producer, an engineer, whoever it may be, just label your tracks and label them with a concise, meaningful name that anybody could look at that track and know what it is. That's the key. It sounds so simple, but so many people don't do it.
And I would add to that, maybe it is a common audio mistake, I think, really. It's like, you'll go and look at someone's project and then it'd be like, right, kick drum is here, and then it'd be like, now I've got my bass and I've got a guitar and I've got two synths and then I've got the snare drum down here.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, what? Like, no, get an organised mind and kind of think, right, my drum tracks, they're going to be at the beginning for me, for instance.
Yep.
I always put my drum tracks at the beginning. I will literally always have the kick drum on channel 1, snare drum on channel 2, overheads, and I will keep this. You could look at a project of mine from 10 years ago and it will basically have the same thing on. So, like, you start to get something. It doesn't have to be the same as someone else's, but you just, like, organise your drums and sort of get a way that you organise them. Organise your, maybe it's logical to have bass next, then guitars, then keyboards, then vocals, or whatever, like, but kind of get a structure to it and stick to it. And so then straight away when you're mixing and when you're coming up with something, where those tracks are. You can go and look at the drums, and I mean, nowadays you can put them in a folder, and just, for instance, in Cubase, you just put all your drum tracks in a folder. I can just play it back, and then I can just solo that folder, and I'm just listening to the drums or whatever.
Yeah.
You don't want to go, oh, yeah, I'll go and find the snare drum because I've got to solo that as well and find out where this is. And like somewhere I put some maracas and I don't know where they are. So, you want to kind of, that organisation. So label your tracks and organise your tracks. And, yeah, do that.
Most definitely. It's going to sound cliched, but it's kind of like that organisation, a clean organisation, for me, results in like a clean mix, a clean
definitely.
project, because
100%.
there's something psychological about it. Like you said, I do the exact same: drums first, then bass, and then synths, guitar, whatever it is, and then vocals are generally at the bottom, then effects, and they're grouped together. It's just making it that streamlined mixing process. Because as you say, what you don't want to do is like someone says, "Oh, can you just solo the drums?" Like you say, "Oh, there's my kick, there's my snare. Got some tops around here somewhere. Not sure where they are, but there is somewhere." And it turns out they're hidden, and then you have to get them back or something along those lines. But yeah, labeling that was huge. I maybe it's I don't know. Maybe it's that sort of coach mentor thing that if you have worked with someone in a studio, or you've gone down the academia route and somebody has said to you, no, you need to label. And it might just be that it's one of those things that's just forgotten. People just immediately get into the creative flow and just forget to label things. But don't, folks. Label things.
Yeah, really, it does really help. It helps you create, I think, and it helps you massively when you go back to projects as well.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
open something up from ages ago and you can't remember it. Well, you don't have to remember it. It's going to be in the order that you normally use,
yeah,
and
yeah.
you will be able to find things. Whereas otherwise, you go like, "Oh, where's that sound coming from? I don't know what that is." And you're going to have a lot. You're going to find that a lot easier to come back to different projects that you've done and have consistency between them all. So yeah,
Yeah.
but I have been there. I was terrible at labelling things. Anyone who knows me, I'm disorganised in many ways, like naturally. So I have to put these things onto myself, and it's quite hard to do. But I have done it
Yeah.
over
I think
years.
the more you do it, like you could even create a template, couldn't you? You could have a template with, and then
Yeah.
drag and drop onto it or something along those lines, and then just use that. That way you know. But I think for the most part, drums, bass, there is a logical flow to how people set up their projects. But there's no hard and fast rule. As long as it makes sense, like as long as you're grouping instruments together, that should be grouped in there next to each other. You know,
Yeah.
it makes sense. A fourth. Do you have another faux pas? Let's say.
Another faux pas. Yeah, I think it would be to to sort of overcomplicate the sort of whole sort of sort of processing of all your things to sort of I've come across this loads of times. I'll look at something and go like, hold on, why is there sort of like 4 EQ plugins on that thing, and then there's like numerous sort of compression and saturation and all this sort of stuff. I've literally come to a channel, somebody's snare drum, and it's got like 9 processors on it, and then you'll listen to it and you'll go like, this sounds horrible. Why is all of this on there? Did your snare sound that horrible in the first place? And often you strip these things back and come to a much simpler thing that is like, we need an EQ plugin, maybe we need a little bit of compression, we need a little bit of reverb or whatever. And yeah, I think over processing is a big mistake when you start. But part of that, and I think you touched on this when we were talking about this before we got going, is kind of choosing the right sounds and recording the right sounds and arranging with the right stuff in the first place. Because if you use the right kick drum, snare drum, bass sound, whatever, you will need to EQ it less, you will need to compress it less, you'll need to do less to it to make it work in the track. If you write the right pattern, for instance, if you've got a bass guitar, make sure that the pattern, the rhythmical pattern is relating to the kick drum or the, that sort of thing in your mix. Sort of, if you've got parts that interlock and relate and give space for other things, you're not going to need to do nearly as much to them because they will just sit with each other. And so naturally your project ought to sit fairly well without a load of EQ and processing going on. And yeah, it's over processing things, and a lot of the time you're over processing things because underneath it you didn't choose the right snare drum in the first place because it just doesn't fit with everything, or you've written in a part that doesn't really sit with everything else, it's too busy or something. So yeah, but over processing, but that leads into sound choice and arrangement, I guess.
Agreed. Over processing, I think, is easily done, and what you mentioned there about sound choice is important. Like you say, spend that extra time choosing the right sounds, or even designing the right sound. If you're using a bass preset in a particular synth, and choosing and sculpting the right sound for what it is you're trying to do. That's a plane.
I might shut the window, guys.
Yeah. So choosing the right sound, sculpting the right sound if you're sound designing, and getting that correct, because I've seen exactly what you've mentioned there, and I remember seeing a vocal track, and I think I mentioned this on the podcast before, of a particular project of someone, and they needed help with this particular vocal because it wasn't sitting correctly, just wasn't sitting in the mix. And I was like, okay, well, show me your project. Before this, we had to go through and label everything, and then they showed me the actual vocal chain. And then I doing the classic teacher thing, being an ex-teacher, I was like, well, explain to me what's going on. And they were like, oh, I don't know. It was just somebody said this was a really good vocal chain. And then I was like, okay. And then it was just EQ on EQ, the compression, some saturation, some reverb, some de-essing, and other bits and pieces, multiple versions. And I'm thinking, get rid of all that, and disable it all, and then we'll start from the top, and then we'll go through. And like you mentioned, it turns out EQ, compression, maybe a touch of saturation on there as well. But I think there is potential. And I remember seeing this on social media a few days ago, or it might have been on another podcast, actually. I think I was listening to another podcast, and they were talking about how don't just adopt. If you see something online that says this is the vocal chain that will do X, Y, Z, or this will make your drums huge, don't just take it and slap it in your mix and then leave it at that, because that's great for them and it works for them. But that works for them in their particular session, in their project, and their sound design, their choices, their recordings. Doesn't mean it's going to translate. It might. You might get lucky and it does. But I think there is an element of that. I think in particular when you first start out is to think, okay, well, that individual has status and says I should do this, so I'm then going to do it. I mean, you might then turn around to me and say, well, Mark, you're saying X, Y, Z now. Why should I listen to you? But I think it's true in that don't just assume that because somebody else says this particular vocal chain or whatever it may be works for them doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate.
No, I would completely agree with that. I think just assuming that like somebody who's got a different drummer with a different drum kit in a different studio, or like different sounds that they've chosen in their project, and slapping the same presets or same mix bus or whatever it is over the top is not going to work. But like at the same time, it's what you need to take from those things is perhaps to look at what the different processors they're using. If you hear a great producer and I love his drum sound, and then he goes through the drum sound on some YouTube thing, you're going like, so what are the processes doing? What are the and why does that make that sound better or sound interesting? And then you can sort of apply those rules and ideas to your mix. You can say, right, I need to make my kick drum sound fatter and fuller in my mix. This guy had a really good way of doing that. I'll try something similar. And so you can definitely pick up things from these things, but just don't assume it's just going to copy straight over,
I think the key there is, and this is also an argument for AI as well. If you're using any sort of assisted mastering, something along those lines, is to deconstruct it. Why have they done that? And then try and emulate it. Like you mentioned there about if you've got a favorite producer, mix engineer, mastering engineer, and they've said they've done this to get this result, then you could follow similar steps with your own mix or production, because you want that particular sound. But you're not copying verbatim their settings. You're just following the process, which I think is a great way of doing it.
Here's a classic rookie mistake that just came into my head. Tune your guitar. There we go.
New strings.
Yeah, new strings. Yeah, that's a good one. Preferably before the sessions, so that they're not like literally going out of tune all the time.
Let them bed in.
Yeah. But like, no, those kind of things that you just like, pay attention to tuning and timing and stuff. And like, but it's a classic is to sort of, and the number of guitars that I recorded where like, I'd be like sort of, we're going to have to redo that again because like, it was basically the guitar wasn't in tune, and like someone was just, I'll just put my distortion pedal on and play my guitar, and like it was like, it sounds even worse now. It's got the distortion pedal on, but get it in tune first, and you just have to be quite disciplined about that sort of thing, because it will really annoy you later when you've just got a load of slightly out of tune guitars everywhere. So.
That comes to session prep, doesn't it? And like, if you're turning up for a recording session, I remember when I was in the band, and we were really good for this. We would make sure we went in, like the drummer would have new skins, make sure that the obviously tune it in the studio, tuning the kit in the studio as well prior to recording and stuff. New sticks, make sure they were sticks that he'd used before. Like, make sure the pedals, because he was a double pedal drummer, make sure that's all like greased up or whatever it was for that. And then with guitars as well, restringing guitars. I got Floyd Rose, so making sure that's sitting right. intonation, checking the
Yeah, that could
intonation
be
on the
fun.
guitar as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
making that's all good. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, if it's not, you're really the one that's going to lose out because you're paying for that studio time. And if you're spending that studio time restringing and waiting for your guitar strings to bed in,
Exactly, yeah.
or you're having to reskin a tom or something along those lines, ultimately,
Or
like,
ask what chords that happen in the middle eight.
yeah, you
what,
say
what
that
happens in this bridge bit, mate? And it's like, okay, you guys sort that out. I'll come back after I've had my tea break.
I've done that. I remember we were recording an album, and I think it was like 10 tracks, and we were pretty good with the prep, but we got in there, and there were bits, and I was just like, I haven't learned this bit yet.
No.
So while the other guitarist is doing his bit, I've got the scratch track headphones sat there with a laptop, just learning this other bit, like ready to go in to record it. But it was a
We've
tune.
all been there. We've all done that. But yeah, I mean, and obviously if you're working on your own, that you might think that doesn't apply so much, but it's very easy to just pick up your guitar and think, that's pretty much in tune. I don't need to tune that. And then it starts to irk you later when you realise it really wasn't that good. And then, so yeah, just take the time to sort of tune things up and that kind of thing, even like though, I get crazy stuff like where people like somebody sends them a project. This is a bit of a nerdy one, but like they send them a project at 44.1 kilohertz and the other person's working at 48, and they don't, when they import them, they don't change the sample rate. And so everything's just a bit out of tune with each other because they record all their parts at 48 next to the stuff that they're playing back in a 48 project, which was recorded at 44.1 or something ridiculous like that. And you get, so it's crazy things where you get tuning anomalies because, obviously in a project, everything should be running at the same sample rate. So always convert whatever tracks you have to the same sample rate and then it'd be fine. But like most DAWs, you do that for you as you import them. But like, but just sort of those kind of things, getting the sample rate consistent across your project and making sure that everything is in tune, it's surprising the number of tuning things you do get and they can sound.
I think with regards to sample rate, I'm with you there. I think just set out early doors to say, okay, no matter what the project, we're always going to operate at this sample rate. So whenever you record something, just assume set it as default, because I try to limit as much as possible sample rate conversion. I just like to bring it in, and that's why I was asked, like, what was this recording at? If you're exporting it, export it at the sample rate that it was recorded at.
Yeah.
And then I'll match that in the session that I'm going to be using just to negate anything like that, because you never know. I mean, the likelihood of anything being going wrong, but it's just another thing you don't have to worry about. But yeah, it's just I think as bands, and when you're an artist in a band and stuff like that, maybe it's just little things like that you just forget and you think, I'll just record it and then it's all good. But then engineers are tearing their hair out.
We used to have this problem, which I don't think is so much of a problem now, but like clocking things. So you'd have different converters in the studio.
Yeah.
And if they weren't clocked properly to the audio card and weren't in sync, then of course they would produce digital clicks and stuff. And I knew this, and I'd always have them synced up. But like I'd sometimes get engineers in, and they're working. Like one guy who used to do stuff for me, and he was a really groovy sort of producer, but he was very lazy. And he just came back from something and he was like, oh, yeah, it sounds mint, mate. I've done this great session with these guys. But, yeah, there's a bit of clicking on it, but you can sort that out, can't you? And he just, like, recorded all of this without any of these converters being actually clocked to the thing.
Yeah.
And there was just clicks all over it. And I was like, well, great, I've now got to sort this out in some way, which I sort of did, but like, it was just it's just one of those examples of sort of not going, oh, well, that'll be all right. No, it probably won't be all right, will it? Sort it now, fix it now, and don't just continue,
Yeah.
But that's one of those things.
I was going to say, I don't think I've experienced that, and it was when I was in a larger studio and I was using tools. And I can't remember the exact situation, but I remember having clocking issues sometimes when I was using tools. And that might be because I think I had this bastardized sort of studio and something wasn't quite right. Anyway, it was all very found pieces of gear that I cobbled together to create a studio many, many years ago. And I remember clocking issues. And especially when you've got a band and they're ready to record, and you're like, I have no idea why this is still happening. And then I'm going through the signal flow trying to work it all out. So that again comes down to preparation. Do it before the band arrives.
Yeah.
So there we go, folks. Those are 5. I think we've banged on enough now about sort of things to be aware of, mistakes to avoid, let's say, but rather than things to be aware of. That's pretty vague in itself. So reference tracks, getting it right at source, labeling, don't overcomplicate and overprocess things, and preparation. Preparation, specifically if you're going in the studio, because it's only going to save you time and headache as well, and money in particular, because as artists, obviously, where we can save money, it is a good thing to do, because going in the studio
because they don't pay us enough.
Well, exactly. Another
0.003 of a cent,
and that's only when you get over 1,000 streams as well.
I know,
isn't that correct?
Terrible.
Isn't that right?
Yeah. Go on.
But yeah, I mean that's when you can jump on your soapbox for there, isn't it, in particular, and discuss that. But there we go. So, folks, if you've got a question you'd like us to hash out on the podcast, again, click that SpeakPipe link in the episode description to submit your question. Again, you don't need an account or a specific microphone. You can if you want. You could just use your mobile phone. Hey, Mark, Tim, this is my question. You can find me at XYZ, or maybe you've got a release coming up. And again, one lucky person each month will win a coffee voucher. Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure, again, speaking with you and having you on the podcast.
No.
And
chatting
about all things mistakes, which is always good fun. There are many, but I probably not going to go into, because some of them happened in studio premises that I didn't own. So I'm not going to go into those on the podcast. I'll catch up with you soon, mate.